Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Change's first virtual Lunch and Learn. My name is Sara Brown, and I am the Executive Director of Change, the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education. I hope each of you is well and healthy and safe. Today, we are going to discuss the role of women during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and I'd like to start with a story. Several years ago, I sat in a living room in eastern Rwanda interviewing Alana and Amanda. I've changed their names to protect their identities. Alana opened with her story. As a Hutu, she was safe from the Interahamwe when the 1994 genocide began. And as a woman, she was ignored by majority men gangs of perpetrators who made their rounds every morning, recruiting able-bodied sons and husbands to participate in the genocide. Alana could have spent those months at home and on her farm, tending to her family and her crops, essentially removed from, but not heedless of, the genocide taking place outside of her compound. She could have chosen to be a bystander. Instead, she ventured to a nearby hill to check on her friend who is a Tutsi, Amanda. She found Amanda at home with her 5 children and her badly beaten husband. When the Interahamwe showed up soon after and took Amanda's husband, Alana wasted no time. She begged Amanda to come with her, and when Amanda refused, Alana grabbed the children and she fled. Amanda eventually made her way to Alana's home, but only after she saw her husband murdered. Together, the women devised a plan to rescue Amanda and her children. Alana's husband returned home to find the house doubled in size and his wife determined. She told him, "We are going to stay the way we are. We are not going to give them out. They're going to stay with us, and if they decide to kill them, then they'll kill all of us all together." After several harrowing months, the RPF liberated their village. Alana, Amanda, and their families survived the genocide. Their stories are incredible and could fill a memoir, several memoirs. When I asked the women why I had never heard of them before, they shrugged. Nobody ever asked. Now, Rwanda is a small country in the middle of Central Africa. It's about 10,000 square miles in size, which for those of us in the United States, that's roughly the size of the state of Maryland. To date, Rwanda does not have a railway system, although that is in the works. It is landlocked and a very hilly terrain. The expression that Rwanda is the land of 1,000 hills is not an exaggeration. They have a limited export market consisting primarily of tea and coffee before the genocide took place, and limited natural resources. They do not have a lot of the mineral wealth that some of their neighbors have, for example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it is a primarily agricultural society. They farm for a living. The genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda began on the evening of April 6th with the assassination of then-President Juvenal Habyarimana. His plane was on approach to Kigali International Airport and was shot out of the sky. At the time that the genocide began, there were 3 ethnic groups living in Rwanda, though the term ethnic group is a little bit problematic. But for the purposes of this discussion, we'll focus on that. There were the Hutus, which were a majority population comprising approximately 85% of the population, or 84% of the population. The Tutsis, who were a minority population comprising about 14% of the population, and then a very small portion of the population was Twa. These statistics are problematic because they come from a troublesome census that was conducted that was highly politicized, but for the purposes of today's conversation, we'll work with the problematic statistics that we have. Juvenal Habyarimana's plane was shot out of the sky the evening of April 6th, and by April 7th, the official date of commemoration for the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, those Rwandans living in Kigali, the capital city, woke up to roadblocks that were staffed by Interahamwe killing militias. They heard lists of prominent Tutsis and Hutu moderates being shared on the radio waves, and they witnessed killings begin across the city. This spread throughout the country in the ensuing 100 days. And during that time, over 1 million people were murdered. Tutsis and Hutu moderates were systematically hunted, tortured, raped, and murdered as part of an orchestrated genocide. Despite the presence of United Nations peacekeeping forces stationed in the country, the genocide continued unabated and without international interference, and was stopped only by the RPF, which took control of the country. Rwandans then began a lengthy reconstruction and rehabilitation process that continues to this day. When I first traveled to Rwanda in 2004, and then subsequent trips after that, something about my visits did not sit well with me. Every time I went, I heard similar refrains. Women were referred to as victims or bystanders. Men were referred to rescuers or perpetrators. The narrative that I heard over and over regarding the genocide seemed incomplete. I felt like something must be missing. Now, despite extensive documentation, the role of women, which it turns out was an elemental component of the genocide in Rwanda, is rarely mentioned in the popular narrative. So when I conducted my doctoral research, starting in 2010 and going through until its completion in 2016, I set out to explore and analyze the central role women played and how they exercised agency as rescuers or perpetrators during the genocide. As women, they took actions and decisions within the context of a deeply entrenched patriarchal system that limited their agency. Genocide narratives traditionally cast the women as victims, and many women did suffer horrific abuses and become victims of torture, sexual violence, and murder in Rwanda. However, this gender-based characterization of women is inaccurate and incomplete. Now, what do I mean by agency? Agency is a tricky term. Women's agency, for the purposes of today's presentation, can be understood as acts of compliance with or resistance against the dominant, violent social structure of the time. Often, these actions were undertaken, especially in the case of rescuers, at great personal risk to self and family. Now, this definition does not imply that there weren't other avenues for agency during the genocide. For example, bystanders chose not to act, and victims exercised their respective form of agency despite tremendously limited options. Additionally, in 1994 Rwanda, women exercised a gender-specific form of agency. Rwandan women were not allowed to inherit property, open a bank account without the written consent of their husband, and representing just 5% of the executive branch of government, they were not in a political position to advocate for change. As such, women exercised an admittedly limited form of agency, operating within a deeply entrenched patriarchal system. When I set out to conduct my research, I decided to base it on oral histories. The majority of the 77 testimonies I gathered and dozens more that I analyzed from other sources came from women. These oral histories capture women's voices and shed light on the agency, thinking, feeling, and behavior of women rescuers and perpetrators before, during, and after the genocide in Rwanda. Today, I will share with you my findings that I set out to answer, and they comprised 3 core questions. Within them were sets of questions, but I'll just keep it simple for today. My first question was, how and why were Rwandan women mobilized to participate in genocide, and by whom? My second question was, what were the specific actions of women who exercised agency during this period of violence and upheaval? What were they thinking and feeling? And my third question pertain to the trajectories of women rescuers and perpetrators in the aftermath of the genocide. Were rescuers hailed as heroes? Were perpetrators brought to justice? So together we are going to compare and contrast, how women rescuers and perpetrators were mobilized, the actions they undertook, and their post-genocide trajectories. First things first, A deeply entrenched patriarchal system was present in 1994 pre-genocide Rwanda, and it limited women's agency. I know I'm repeating myself, but it needs to be repeated. This system was pervasive in public and private spheres and enshrined in law, ensuring that women were second-class citizens at best within their own state. As a result, when women were mobilized to participate in genocidal violence in 1994, the strategies that were employed appealed to their gendered and subordinate role in society. Take, for example, the role of the media, notably the print publication Kangura, which was a mouthpiece for Hutu extremists. Here on this image, you can see one of the popular cartoons that was spread in Kangura. And it says in Kinyarwanda at the top, here's the English translation, that General Dallaire and his army have fallen into the trap of Tutsi femme fatales. And here you see General Dallaire, who was then the head of the UN peacekeeping forces in Rwanda, being seduced by two women, presumably Tutsi women, as they are depicted in the cartoon. And you can see that a Belgian guard is standing watch as he is being seduced and manipulated by these women in the cartoon. Cartoons like this hypersexualized Tutsi women, they othered Tutsi women, they depicted Tutsi women in particular as this particularly nefarious threat. That theme continues with the Hutu 10 Commandments. Now, the Hutu 10 Commandments, it's a list of 10 commandments about how to be a good Hutu. And it's not lost on me, as it was not lost on society at the time, where Rwanda was over 90% Christian. The use of the expression 10 commandments was an extremely effective one, and it was not lost on that population. And it's interesting to note that the first 3 commandments all pertain to women. The first commandment, as you can see here, it includes mobilizing rhetoric aimed specifically at women or about them. Actually, that's the case with all 3. And here in the first one, you see that it identifies Tutsi women as a threat to the Hutu cause. This was intended to further dehumanize a subsect of the Tutsi population, Tutsi women in particular, and identify them as a particular threat and an inhuman them in a us versus them paradigm. The second commandment praises the virtues of Hutu women and offers a positive identification of the us group, in this case the Hutus, and more specifically of Hutu women. The pairing of these two only further breaks down any bonds that may have been forged between women who shared similar experiences of gender-based oppression in Rwanda at that time. It's also interesting to note that the values of women and their Hutu women in particular, that they're expressed as good secretaries, not necessarily leaders. And the third Hutu commandment, the third commandment in the Hutu 10 Commandments, encourages Hutu women to be vigilant and make their men see reason. This thereby sanctions the agency of women who, up until now, are socially and culturally restricted from standing up to a man. These commandments and the importance of them, they're the first 3. They're listed as the 10 commandments in a predominantly Christian society. The importance of this is not lost on Hutu women at the time. These commandments were revolutionary. Now, another mouthpiece for Hutu extremists was RTLM radio. It was popular among women and men alike, and one of their most well-known radio broadcasters was Valerie Bemeriki. As one of the few women who had gained entry into the male-dominated public sphere of radio, Bemeriki became a role model for Hutu women and a galvanizing force for Hutu men who did not want to appear to be leading from behind. Here was Bemeriki, who was very known for these very impassioned broadcasts. Here she was telling them to go out and do this work, as they referred to it, all euphemisms during in genocidal rhetoric is such a interesting area of study. Here she was encouraging them to go out and do work. They didn't want to appear to be leading from behind or doing what a woman said, and so this was further galvanizing when Bemeriki would give these impassioned speeches. Political leaders also played a role, although it appears that for women in particular, they were less knowledgeable about national dynamics on the whole and more oriented around their local hill. This was particularly the case in rural Rwanda. So when I met with women and asked them what they were hearing and what were the dynamics leading up to the genocide, they were more apt to reference things heard on the radio, in the marketplace, from their local Interahamwe militia leaders, from school teachers, or from church leaders. Thus, the leadership that influenced them was decidedly more local. Fear was also pervasive. References to shouting, running, gunfire, killing, and chaos were shared among both women rescuers and perpetrators alike, and they were utilized by the media and leadership to catalyze violence as well. That said, I really want to stress that women rescuers heard, saw, and read hate propaganda, and they experienced fear, terror, and anxiety. But women rescuers rejected these mobilization efforts and did not give in to fear. While each experience was unique, I want to note that certain common themes are discernible. Among women rescuers, commonalities included a capacity to think critically about and eventually reject messages of hatred. Women rescuers would analyze extremist propaganda and were more apt to think for themselves than to follow the words of another. Some rejected their leadership, instead relying on the lessons learned from their family, while others followed the teachings of their faith. Another unexpected, but not maybe unsurprising factor that I discovered was the absence of a male head of house in the majority of the homes that rescued. I interacted with 16 women rescuers, and 9 of the 16 did not have a male spouse at home during the genocide. My belief is that this was, for some, a determining factor for rescue, as they were not subject, according to both law and custom, to the authority of a man. Women rescuers also experienced added fear as a result of the violence and chaos around them, as well as added fear and vulnerability because of their decision to rescue. Still, rather than give in to that fear, most women rescuers resolved to suffer the same fate as the people they rescued, as was evidenced by the story of Alana and Amanda. Now, I thought I would have more to say about women perpetrators and their mobilization, but what I had initially anticipated going into my research is not what I found out. I had anticipated that women perpetrators would embrace extremists' mobilization efforts and that they would speak to me about it. Unfortunately, it's difficult to say what they heard or felt, as the majority of the women perpetrators I interviewed denied their participation in the genocide in some way or completely, and with it, the mobilization efforts that would have catalyzed their involvement. Now, this surprised me, and it may surprise some of you who are familiar with prior studies of men perpetrators, which reveal a willingness, sometimes even an eagerness, on the part of men perpetrators to detail their crimes. In contrast, the women perpetrators I interacted with were reticent to admit some or all of their crimes, and with it, their mobilization. And I'll address this in a little bit more detail in a moment. Now, when it comes to the actions undertaken during the genocide, it should be noted that on the whole, women rescuers and perpetrators alike could have chosen to be bystanders to the violence. With a few exceptions, they were not actively recruited by the Interahamwe killing militias. Their participation was voluntary. And for the rescuers, they could have stood by and done nothing, though many of them clearly did not. Now, rescue included acts of direct assistance, both large and small, and the rescuers faced seemingly insurmountable challenges and great risks. They were not ignorant of this, yet they still rescued. Successful rescue hinged on chance encounters, good fortune, or unlikely situations, and failed attempts were frequent. Local knowledge was a significant factor that contributed to successful rescue, from knowledge of terrain. As you can see here, there's an image of a very well-known rescuer named Josephine Dusabimana. This photo is part of the Proof Media for Social Justice exhibit picturing moral courage, the rescuers. And Josephine utilized her knowledge of the lake and the waterways and various beachfronts in order to smuggle Tutsis who were targeted for murder across the lake and into the safety of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Other women rescuers relied on their knowledge of spiritual practices and superstitions, and in certain instances, even sexism saved lives. For example, if women were the head of the household, they were less likely to suffer the daily visits from the Interahamwe in search of male recruits, and as a result were also spared their indoctrination. In other instances, the gendered perceptions of the private domestic sphere saved women from searches in their home. Other women benefited from sexist perceptions that underestimated, ignored, or diminished them. For example, one woman rescuer I interviewed rescued an infant, and at the time she was a nursing mother with an infant she had just recently birthed. So here she was now nursing and caring for two infants. And when the Interahamwe militia found out that she had done this, they showed up at the compound. They saw her nursing the two children, and she's a very slight woman, very slender. And they immediately said, she's so slim, she's so frail, there's no way she'll be able to support both of these babies with her milk, and they both will die. So she's already been punished enough, and they left. Now, both of those children survived and thrived. When considering the motivations of women rescuers, I found repeated references to morality and shared humanity. In addition, religion served as a primary catalyst for many rescuers. Others reference their maternity and popular gendered notions of motherhood. And still others rescued because of friendship or because their parents or grandparents had rescued during prior episodes of violence in Rwanda or had themselves experienced discrimination and taught those lessons to their children. Moving to the actions of perpetrators, I want to point out one key finding that may appear obvious. Women perpetrators were by and large ordinary people. They did not display symptoms of psychopathy. And though many women perpetrators describe the genocidal environment as one that continued to be dominated by men, it turns out that women perpetrators represent a much larger number than previously believed. Initially, estimates were that about 3,000 women were suspected of participating in the genocide, and this was based on early incarceration rates after the genocide. Later, when the local hybrid judicial system known as the Gacaca courts was formed, and then in 2004, went nationwide in 2006 and completed in 2012, after those the statistics and information from the Gacaca courts was released, we find that the numbers of women who participated in the genocide is in fact much higher. So of the 1,003,227 suspects that were tried by Gacaca, 96,653 were women. And that represents nearly 10% of everybody brought to dock. And even factoring in the percentage of people who were found not guilty, this is still a much higher number than was initially believed. And the majority of women I interviewed, they had participated in acts of indirect crimes that did not include physical force. I should note that. Still, some did murder, and some admitted it to me. Others raped, though I will note that I was not able to interview a woman perpetrator who admitted to this, and I was only able to interview one male survivor of rape who agreed to speak with me. And I suspect, by the way, that this is not because it did not occur, but instead because of a stigma that emasculates and isolates men victimized by rape. Valerie Bemariki, pictured on the screen, and this image is from a film, a French film, directed by Alexander Westphal and Violaine Baraduc. Valerie was with RTLM radio throughout this period, and she worked very hard to reassure listeners that the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Tutsi rebel group, was to blame for the violence and the unrest and not Hutu extremists or the government or the Interahamwe killing militias. Instead, she argued that the extremists were victims. And here is a sample transmission. This one is from May 17th, 1994. And this is her message to the people listening on RTLM. All the people who were killed in the country are victims of the RPF. It is the cockroach in Kotani, the time this was used as a derogatory term for the RPF rebel group, who has killed them and nobody else. That is why the Presidential Guard should not be disbanded. It did nothing wrong. That is why the government should not be dissolved. It was legally set up and did not carry out any killings. It was rather set up to reestablish the security that the RPF has troubled. Now, as I mentioned before, a major unexpected issue I faced was that many women denied altogether their participation in the genocide, or in some form. In the end, 22 of the 26 women that I interviewed denied their involvement in some way, shape, or form, even though they had confessed to the Gacaca courts, or in one instance, the instance of Valerie Bemariki, to the national courts. Some even argued that as women, they were incapable of participating, relying on gendered tropes and expectations around women's behavior. In order to verify these claims, I randomly sampled 9 women and compared their interviews with their Gacaca court transcripts, and I found that 7 had substantial inconsistencies. My belief is that these women misrepresented their stories to me, perhaps due to gendered interpretations of women's participation in violence as unacceptable, and therefore cause for shame and denial. I feel that this may also inform why some are, and mostly all, are largely absent from the mainstream narrative. I also found an interesting formula emerge in my interviews. The less forthcoming the woman perpetrator was, the less remorse she tended to express, and the more she emphasized personal suffering and loss when I would ask her what she regretted. By and large, women went unnoticed in the immediate post-genocide period in Rwanda. Some even made their way to the United States and established new lives despite their participation in the genocide. While the successful gender mainstreaming initiatives in Rwanda resulted in the first women majority parliament in the world, and incredible leaders like the person that you see on the screen to our left, if you're looking at the screen, the late Aloysia Nyumba, even despite efforts of these incredible women, Rwanda still grapples with the role of women in society and in history. Now, the immediate post-genocide reality in Rwanda was chaotic. The RPF instituted a unity government, and that government, along with the international community, shared a gendered blind spot when it came to women who did not fit the common narrative of bystander or victim. As a result, most women perpetrators rejoined society and resumed their lives and work as though they had committed no crime. Life went back to normal for these women, until later, when the repercussions of this gender-based impunity by attrition culture were recognized as subversive, and the Gacaca courts were established. Many women perpetrators I interviewed recalled being surprised when they were called before the courts and charged. For them, over 10 years had passed, and they could not believe that suddenly someone was interested in the role that they had played. Marginalization of rescuers remains a challenge in Rwanda, and we still don't know how many there are. While a desire for justice produced a mechanism for identifying genocide perpetrators, very little power, manpower or woman power, or funds have been dedicated to identifying rescuers. The Ibuka Rescuers Project pilot study, the largest of its kind in Rwanda, covered just 14% of the country before funding ran out. While some efforts have been undertaken to acknowledge and reward rescuers, including 3 of the women that I interviewed, the reception of rescuers differs according to ethnicity. Some women rescuers noted that they received thanks and appreciation from the people they helped, but women rescuers often experience a continuum of violence evident in the disruption of everyday life, displacement, continued insecurity, and silences buried. I was surprised to learn that some women rescuers continue to hide their acts of heroism for fear of retribution or alienation. Others were unable to do so after the genocide and faced violent repercussions. Some had to relocate and hide their identity. Others have fallen into a tense routine with their neighbors that may not include direct violence, but often includes regular verbal abuse or ostracization. Still others faced jealousy and accusations of hidden wealth due to the isolated efforts of the government and survivor organizations to reward some rescuers. Still, other women remained impoverished because of their acts of rescue due to bribes paid to the Interahamwe or destroyed property from vengeful neighbors. I also found that women rescuers who lived alone were more likely to report feeling unsafe. This intersection of sex and security was key to several women who assessed their safety according to the absence or presence of a man in the home. And several women who share the dual identity of rescuer and survivor faced compounded risks. In summary, I found that women did play a significant role during the genocide in Rwanda, both as rescuers and as perpetrators. While gendered assumptions about women's agency and conduct during the genocide in Rwanda have thus far pushed women's agency and actions to the background of the mainstream narrative, in 1994 Rwanda, women could be mothers, wives, daughters, sisters, and rescuers or perpetrators. These roles were not and are not mutually exclusive. Though fewer in number than the men who acted during the genocide, and marginalized socially and economically within Rwandan society, the women who exercised agency during the genocide in Rwanda were noteworthy, and their participation continues to impact Rwanda today. Now, I want to thank all of you for joining us today for our first Lunch and Learn. To join our mailing list and learn about upcoming Lunch and Learns, we're going to be hosting 3 more this month. One about a survivor of the Holocaust, another about a survivor from the Armenian Genocide, and another featuring the LGBTQ+ community. Please email us at contact@change.org. That's contact@change with 2 H's.org. In addition, please join us on Facebook as we commemorate the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi on April 7th at 11:30 a.m., Yom HaShoah on April 21st at 9:30 a.m., and a commemoration of the Armenian Genocide on April 23rd at 7 p.m. These are all Eastern Time. Thank you all. We hope to host you at our center once things return to what will likely be a new normal. Until then, be well and take care. Thank you.